All right, folks, we made it to our last video of part 1 for chapter 7, and also our last stop on the axial skeleton tour, and that is the thoracic cage, or good old rib cage. Now, the purpose of the rib cage is to protect the lungs and the heart, and also give structure for the lungs. And when we get into respiratory system, you'll see those details as we go along. All right, so again, this is going to be our rib cage, and they're going to protect the thoracic cavity and provide structure for the lungs. Now, this is going to consist of thoracic vertebrae, which are going to be our thoracic vertebrae we already saw when it came to the spine, and also the ribs, sternum, and intercostal cartilage. So the first we're going to talk about is ribs, then we'll get into sternum, and then we'll talk about the intercostal cartilage, and then we'll move on from there. Now, when it comes to thoracic vertebrae, we know that the ribs are going to attach to the thoracic vertebrae as well. So we got to keep all those things in mind. Let's orient ourselves here. First, we see our scapula or our shoulder blade. Then we see our clavicle. We have the sternum here, and we have all the ribs surrounding it. And then we have our thoracic vertebrae here. Okay, folks? Now, the ribs are broken into 3 different types: true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. So first, let's focus on the true ribs, which are usually ribs 1 through 7. The false ribs next that we're going to talk about is usually going to be ribs 8 through 10. And then 11 through 12 are going to be our floating ribs, or the last 2 ribs. So let's go ahead and count them here. We have our first rib here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and of course 11. Now we also have 11, and then we have 12, because again we have 24 ribs, but we only need to focus on 12 because again they're going to be double the number. Okay? Now that means 12 pairs of ribs. And ribs are literally flat bones that wrap around the chest, so yes, they do have some curvature to them. Now the true ribs are called true ribs because they attach directly to the sternum. And we call the sternum, usually it's called our breastplate. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And we'll talk about that later. Now, and how they attach to it via cartilage. So you'll see all the blue here is going to be our cartilage. Let me get a better skin color. Blue is going to be our cartilage, and that's going to be our intercostal cartilage. That's going to connect the ribs to the sternum. Now, false ribs are a little bit different. So let's go ahead and get all of our intercostal cartilage for 6 and for 7. You see how those connections are. Straight to the sternum here. Straight connecting to the sternum. And of course on the other side as well. But when you get to the false ribs, 8 through 10, they're not directly connected to the sternum. They're indirectly connected to the sternum, or not at all. Let's see how that all works. So you see that we have intercostal cartilage here. But when you look at rib number 8, that intercostal cartilage is going to connect to the intercostal cartilage of rib 7. And that's how indirectly it can connect to the sternum. Same thing with 9, same thing with 10. It's all going to be indirect. So you can also say false ribs are going to connect to other intercostal cartilage. Okay? And let's go ahead and get to our final ones, which are going to be floating ribs. And these floating ribs are going to not connect to the sternum at all. Okay, so there's no sternal attachment. You can even see that here. Here's our floating rib here. Here's another floating rib coming around here. They are not attached to the sternum in any way, so that's where they're considered floating. For its purpose, we know that there are 12 thoracic vertebrae that's going to articulate with ribs. So again, form that joint connection with ribs. Okay, just to keep it all clear. Now, let's then talk about the sternum, which is going to be a flat bone, just like the ribs are flat bones. And we also call this the breastplate, or it also kind of looks like a little necktie. You're like draw a little necktie. Kind of looks like that as well. And when it comes to this, these are going to be 3 bones fused together. So the 3 bones that are fused together is going to be the top of your actual sternum, which is the manubrium here. Then you have the body. And then you have the xiphoid process. And of course, we're going to see the 3D versions of all these as well. So you could say, mark the body with an X so that you can remember manubrium, body, and xiphoid process. Okay? Now, the intercostal cartilage is going to connect ribs 1 through 10, meaning the first 7 are true ribs. And then we also have the first the first 3 false ribs. So 1 through 10 are going to be connected through intercostal cartilage to the sternum itself. Okay? What's the point of the intercostal cartilage? Of course, flexibility. You make things flexible, and it's going to make them strong. Why do they need to be flexible? Well, breathe in and breathe out. You'll see that the ribs are moving, right, as you're breathing in and breathing out, allowing space for the lungs. So they definitely need to be flexible, but they also need to be strong enough to protect the lungs and the heart as well. Now let's see what your textbook shows you about this as well. So we have some different pictures. So again, we see our true ribs, our false ribs, and our floating ribs. We see our vertebrae, our sternum, and then we also see our articulations of the vertebrae and the true ribs. And then we also have another image of a typical rib itself. You see how it's flat, but it's also curved as well. We also see another true rib here. It's going to be connected to our thoracic vertebrae and to the sternum as well. So we see that intercostal cartilage, and we also see that articulation between the facet that we saw when it came to the thoracic vertebrae and the rib itself. So that's really cool. Let's get into some 3D steps. We have our ribs in our rib cage. We see the thoracic vertebrae here attaching the ribs, even the floating ones. And we see our true ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, 9, and 10 are our false ribs, and then of course our floating ribs here. We also see our sternum. We're going to have the manubrium, or the head of the sternum, the body of the sternum, and then the xiphoid process. Okay, folks? Now let's go ahead and look at the body of the sternum. Then I want to show you the manubrium of the sternum itself. Show you this view, smaller, which is going to be the sternum attaching to a rib. Of course, it's directly attached, so we know that's a true rib. And that rib is, again, curved, attaching to the thoracic vertebrae. That's what I want to show you. How do we know it's a true rib? Because it's directly attaching to the sternum. It doesn't have to go through extra and intercostal cartilage in order to attach indirectly. That's a false rib. And of course, if it's not attached at all, that is a floating rib. What we see here is a better view of the intercostal cartilage as well. Okay, folks? That's going to be our intercostal cartilage, excuse me. We also see the connective tissue cartilage that's cushioning the vertebrae. We go back to that as well. Okay, folks? So that is going to be in the end of our axial skeleton tour. We went through our skull. We went through our spine. We also went through our, well, we're finishing with the rib cage. Okay, folks? See you in part 2, which is going to be Wednesday's lecture. Please know I'm trying my best to try to make these get to you faster, but it is taking me a long time for a myriad of reasons. So thank you for your patience, and I'll see you on Wednesday.